Here is Sailor Studio 264. Now, don't be fooled by the swatch. That looks more blue than the writing sample. The writing sample and the chromatography show the truth about this very nice teal. The tone of this ink can be affected by the paper you use, but it will always shade very nicely. Now, this can be aggressive on non-fountain pen friendly paper, getting very deep into the paper. And unfortunately, it can be prone to feathering, and that's kind of a big drawback. Now, teal and turquoise inks aren't really my thing, but more than that, it's the aggressiveness of this ink into the paper that puts a barrier between me and a bottle. So it's not just the color that makes me not want a bottle of it. It's the aggressiveness as the main point.
The pen for today is a Pelikan M1000. And now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how we got there by looking at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
What a lovely teal with great shading all the way through. No feathering and no spreading, but look at it. This super white paper really brings out the teal that we can see it. This is not just a theorem. When you look at theorem, where the T is lighter, the HE get quite a bit darker, lightening up into the OR with a very dark EM at the end. This is going to be really good. Not profound when it comes to what goes on in the shading. It's not going to do the full camouflage, but it's going to do well with a darker P, nice midtones fluctuating from darker to lighter midtones through the middle of the word with a very dark D at the end. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Sailor makes more than one ink, so let's take a look at a few other inks from Sailor. Here is Sailor Studio 437.
Here is Sailor Bungo Box Tipsy.
Here is Sailor Taroguro.
Here is Sailor Cherry Blossom.
The second writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter notebook.
Here we see that the tone is just a bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade, not as well as it did on the Clairfontaine technically, but still shading really well. Look at technically on the first line. That T to E is a nice midtone, lightening a little bit on the C, dark at the H, back to midtone with the NICA. The first L, a little bit darker. LY at the end, quite a bit darker. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, no ghosting.
There's a lot to be learned by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is done the way it's supposed to be done. A line of ink is put down to immediately put into water to show the separation of those colors, making the ink. Now the one on the right is marked with a D. This is allowed to dry for 10 minutes before it's put into water. The third writing sample is done in a national brand Steno notebook.
We can see here that the tone here becomes, instead of a teal, much more of a green with a slight teal lean to it. What that means is that this is a bit translucent as in ink. It is going to be affected by the tone of the paper underneath. Now, this does not feather. It does not spread. It does shade just as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. You don't have to really go very far to find some shading. In fact, one of the words with the least amount of shading would be alternative at the top, which still has plenty of it back and forth, just not as hugely as pronounced as the rest of the writing. Looking at the back of the page, we can see that there's quite a few spots that it got very deep into the paper. There's minor ghosting. Otherwise, I would probably write on the back of this page, these did not bleed through. They did not touch the page underneath.
Resistance tests are done to see how well this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. Now, this smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. In the upper left, you can see where there is highlighter. In the upper right, that is pen flush. The lower left has a 1/3 bleach solution, and the lower right has plain old water. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Here we can see that we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, does not spread, shades about as well, about the same, maybe just a little bit less than it does on the Clairfontaine. I was a little concerned about how well this would stand out against the quad rule, but looking at it here, you see it stands out without any kind of a problem. I thought the tone might be a little too close-ish, being a little lighter, but no problem. The quad rule really melted into the background, going away. Good if this is the type of paper you go for. Looking at the back of the page, we'll be able to point out spots that I'm not sure if they're going to come through on camera, but there's a number of spots where it got very deep into this page, and this is not the type of paper that tends to have that problem. This is some of the aggressiveness that I was talking about with it. This is an unusual thing to happen and is always concerning. It's a little bit of a warning sign for me. So you could write back here, this is just, again, that warning sign. Nothing bled through touching the page underneath.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at a few more teal or turquoise inks.
Here is Scribo Blue Capri.
Here is Schaefer Turquoise.
Here is Tasha Hokusai Fukaki Hanada. Here is Tag Kayo Oto Hisoku.
All of the inks that you just saw have a review here on the channel. Now, the next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Here we can see that the tone is lighter, is flatter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, does not spread. It does shade much less than it did on the Clairfontaine, but still shaded. Now, strangely, I see the quad rule here much more than I did on the Rhodia. So that's why it's always worthwhile to check the paper. This is not something I would recommend a student to do because it could become a little more visually confusing in what I'm seeing here. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
While it's nice to see inks that are in the same color family, I prefer to find inks that complement the color on the page. Here is Monteverde Mandarin Orange. Here is Diamine Purple Pizzazz. Here is Zenzoi Black. Here is Diamine Red Dragon. The best way you can support this or any channel that you like watching is to alert the retailer of where you saw the product at time of purchase. Now, the last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Here we can see that the tone is lighter, is flatter than it was on the Clairfontaine. Now, there's no major feathering. There is some spread, which we would expect on this paper. There's minor bits of shading that do go on whenever it kind of overlaps on itself, and minor feathers. It's there, not horrible, just like in other spots where it's just tiny and there. This is not a combination I would go with because look at 2 right there. That's distracting to look at. Kind of makes us lose our purpose. When we look at here, the purr is fine. The puss at the end, a little feathery for me. I wouldn't go for it. I see it really in the P and the S. I don't mind occasional tiny, but I can pretty much go to many words and find some of that feathering. Use it if you'd like. I would not. Looking at the back of the page, it is got a ton of ghosting, which is not uncommon for this paper. More specifically, while we couldn't use it for all the back of the page for all the ghosting, I'm just circling the spots where it did bleed through and touch the page underneath. So it did have just a little bit of bleed on this paper.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
This is a wet, fine nib in the Pelikan M1000, and the shading is always nice. But on non-fountain pen friendly paper, it can be a bit aggressive, and I saw a ton of that in some of the writing off camera. Also, off camera, I tried to tame some of the aggressiveness by using a dry medium pen, and it didn't misbehave nearly as much. It's still shaded and more or less held strong in tone. So, to keep control over the aggressiveness and to keep the tone and shading, I suggest going with a medium to dry, medium, or fine pen.